In this quick video, I'm showing you two simple but powerful ways to use inverted masks in your Photoshop workflow. With this image, I'm going to add texture in the foreground foliage and use a solid colour fill to add depth of colour in selective areas using inverted masks. These tricks can really add depth to your imagery or photos. Let's get started. What is an inverted mask in Photoshop? Basically, inverting a mask changes the visibility of the layer's content. White becomes black and black becomes white. Let me show you practical ways that you can use an inverted mask. What I want to do with this image is put a little bit more texture, a little bit more detail or colour into the foreground foliage. And I'm going to use a texture, inverted mask, and then brush that texture through to come into that foreground. Let me show you how. I've added the texture that I want to use to add the detail into the foliage. Let's have a look at the layer stack, and you can see it's a texture and it's called Sage Texture from one of my texture collections. I'm going to turn that layer on, and you'll see now why I've chosen this. It's got green and it's mottled and it's got a subtle texture coming through. And I'll often use this in certain images where I want to get a little bit more texture or detail in certain areas. For example, it could be sand on a beach or a seascape. It could be that you want to add a little bit more texture into, like I am, the foliage of this forest. What I'm going to do now is actually apply a mask, invert the mask, and then brush that texture through. I'm going to come down to the bottom of the layer stack, add a mask, and you can see now it's a white mask. But what I want to do is invert that. And the shortcut key is Control-I to invert. And I'll do that on the keyboard. Now you can see that the mask has gone black, but the texture's disappeared, but it's there. Now what I want to do is brush in that texture into certain areas. What I'm going to do is come down to the foreground, make sure it's white. How I remembered masks and working with masks when I first started was white mask, black brush. Black mask, white brush. For my mind, that worked for me to retain that information. Foreground's white. I'm going to get my brush tool. What I'm going to do is change the opacity, and I'll do it quite high so you can actually see what I'm doing. Now I'm going to come over into this area and I'm going to brush or mask in that texture. And as I go through, you can see now it is brushing that texture through, but that's a bit too strong. So I'm going to undo that, change my opacity to what I call a real opacity. And I might start around about the 14%. And I'm just masking or brushing in that texture where I want. Now it's subtle. What I'm doing is just choosing a texture that's got lovely green in it, but it's a soft texture. Let's come over here, brush this into this area and this area here, and I'll just put that there. Might add a little bit more here. Now, you can't see a big difference, but when I turn this layer off, have a look at that foliage. And it just gives some depth. I haven't been too fussy in my brushwork, but when you're doing this, this is where you can either select an area or you can do what I call freehand brushing in there. Now, I might come up here and think, oh, do I want that there? No. Is there any other areas that I could brush that texture in? And I think, no, that works for me. The next technique is where I'm going to use a solid colour fill and add some colour into the leaves on the tree and also into the trunk. Now I want to use a solid colour fill, and what I'm going to do is invert the mask and brush in that solid colour fill in the areas that I want. For example, the leaves gives it a little bit more depth. What I'll do is come down to the bottom of my layer stack. I'll click here and I'll choose solid colour. Now I'm going to go for an orange, like a tobacco colour I'll call it, so we can actually see, and I might just come down a little bit, and that's exactly the colour that I'm after. Now what I'm going to do is click on OK. You can see that the mask is white, but what I want to do now is invert that mask. So the shortcut key is Control-I or Command-I, and there is my black or inverted mask. I look at the foreground colour, it's white, which means that it allows me to brush that colour into the areas that I want. I'll get my brush tool, I'll start at 14% opacity, and I'll just make my brush a little bit smaller. And I'm going to just freehand brush over those leaves. Now I might bump up that opacity to give a little bit more contrast. Now if you do too much opacity, it becomes a solid colour, and you don't want that. What I'm going to do is fine-tune my selection and then use the inverted mask to brush that colour in. I'll come up and I'll choose the Object Selection tool. I'm just going to draw a square over that leaf or foliage area there, and it's selected that area, and that's exactly what I want. I'll get my brush tool. I'll make sure that the opacity is at a low. I think 17 might be okay on this. Let's try it. And I'm going to mask that colour in. I'll deselect by Control-D or Command-D. Let's turn that layer off and on. And you can see I've just brushed it in a certain area. Let's come and have a look at where I can also brush in some more depth of colour into this area. Might come up here, just brush. Now I can see that that's a little bit too strong on the opacity. I'll undo that. I'll drop that opacity down to about 14%. And this is where you play with your opacity. Now all I'm adding is subtle depth of colour in areas that I'm brushing this tobacco colour into the areas that I want. Now I'll come up here to the top, I'll make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'll just brush across that area, and I might brush in there, this area here, and you can see I'm just adding depth in that area. Now I look at that and I think that's too strong. It's not what I want, so I'll undo that, and then I'll even drop the opacity down further. All I'm wanting is subtle colour depth coming through. I've gone too far again, so I'm going to just come in and brush those areas. And I might do a little bit of brushwork up here to give you an idea where I can brush that colour in. I might come over here to give a balance of depth of colour on that left-hand side of the tree. I'm going to turn this layer off and on, and you can see the difference now. I look at this area here and I think, no, I don't like that there. So what I'm going to do is change my brush to black, so the foreground is black, which does the reverse. I can brush away what I've painted. Now I may have to lift the opacity for that, and I'll just brush that off. So what I'm doing is masking or brushing away the colour that I put in. I'll turn that layer off and on. And I look at this again and I think, oh, I don't like that. That's too strong. I'm going to make sure I brush that away. And there is some subtle colour depth added using an inverted mask. Now, what if I wanted to add a little bit more of a colour to the tree trunks? I can do the same technique using an inverted mask and a solid colour fill. Let's try that now and we can see how we are building up colour depth in your image using this technique. I'm going to add another solid colour fill, so I'll come down to the bottom of the layer stack, click here and choose solid colour. With this, I want a little bit more of a dark colour, and I can come over here and choose something that's a little bit more depth into what I call a charcoal grey or a charcoal black. And that's got a little bit more purple or red tinge in it, and I don't want that. Let's come up to the orange slider and choose a different kind here. Now that's too light, but I just want to get the right tone. I'll go with that at the moment. That's the colour. I click on the mask. I invert the mask by Control-I or Command-I. What I want to do is make sure my foreground is white. So I'll click on that double-headed arrow and make it white. I've got my brush tool, the opacity. This is where I might go down about an 8% because what I want to do is add depth of colour, but I'm not adding light. So what I'm going to do is just brush in up that tree trunk. And I can come along there, and this is where you're sculpting the colour in the areas that you want. Now let's turn that layer off and on. Very subtle. So I've probably gone too low in the opacity. So I'm going to come up now and change the opacity, and I'll do, say, 25. This is trial and error. And I'll just brush up those tree trunks there to add some depth of colour. And I think that that's got too much grey in it because I don't want that trunk there to be the focus. I'll turn the layer off and on, and it works on the trunk of the tree on the left-hand side, but for my eye, on the right-hand side, it doesn't. So I get my brush, I make sure that the foreground is black, and I'm going to brush or mask off that grey or charcoaly colour that I did in that area. Let's turn that layer off and on. And you can see now that it's actually working on that left-hand side of the trunk. What happens if I wanted to add a little bit more blue at the end of the road, or maybe a little bit more orange into the leaves that are on the road? I do like this colour here, so what I'm going to do is click on the mask, make sure that my foreground is white. My opacity, I'll try 25%. Let's see what that does. And then I'm just going to freehand brush across that foliage. Now I can see that that's too strong in the opacity for that foreground. I'll drop the opacity. I'll get into 14%. I'm just brushing in that colour along that road. I might even go along the edge. And this is adding depth of colour. Now, you could also brush in that colour on the foliage here where I had that texture, and I might put a little bit of brushwork there. And I can see now, no, it doesn't work, so I'll undo. Let's now add some colour into the end of the road, a bit of a blue colour. I'll use a solid colour fill again. So I'm going to come down to the bottom of the layer stack, choose a solid colour, I want to go into the blue area, but I don't want it to be a bright blue. I want it to be a subtle blue that just will give depth. And I might go with that. This is trial and error on the colours. There's my blue. I click on the mask. I invert the mask with Control-I or Command-I. Make sure my foreground brush is white. I've got the brush. I'm going to make the brush bigger. Now the opacity is at 14. I'm going to try it. Let's see. Dab some blue in that area. That's my technical term. And I might even come in here. And all I'm adding in some depth of colour. Now that's a little bit too blue for my eye. What I can do is actually change the opacity on the layer. I'll drop that down to about 67, maybe in 80%. Let's turn that layer off and on. What a difference it's done with it. Now let's zoom right back, and this is where you can see how the colour's working. I'll turn that layer off and on. And that gives that, what I call that mystical colour, that bluey fog coming through. Is there anywhere else that I would like to brush in some solid colour fill? At this stage, I'd say no, but I could even extend this further if I wanted to add some texture into the tree trunks. But this video was about showing you some techniques how to use the inverted mask, 1, to sculpt colour into certain areas, 2, to add texture into an area, for example, that foliage. Let's turn off all the layers that I've used the inverted mask on and see what the difference it has made to this image. I'll just turn all those layers off, and that's the base image that I started with. I added texture into the foliage. I've added that tobacco colour into the leaves to give it a little bit more depth. I'll turn that layer on and off, and you can see now it has got that colour depth. I've added in charcoaly grey into the tree trunks just to give it a little bit more lift, which is another form of sculpting light using colour. And I've added a solid colour fill for that fog area in the distance. Now what I can do is merge all those layers using Control-Alt-Shift-E, and then what I can do is even dial down the opacity on all those colours there and just see what it does. And I'll play with the blend mode. I might come down to multiply. Now let's have a look at it playing with the opacity. If I'm coming up, I'm getting really dark, but if I drop the opacity right down, this is where I can see that colour depth that I've used with the solid colour fills. Let's turn that layer off and on. This is about adding that colour depth, sculpting colour and light into selective areas. There are so many ways in Photoshop and techniques that you can use, but what I've done with this video is concentrated on inverted masks and how you can add them into your workflow. Have fun using the inverted masks and also have fun being creative. Thanks for watching.